Expectations for North Korea. Let's talk about it tonight.
The Dan York State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
You know, we're fortunate to have a brain trust here who can talk about these international issues with the level of expertise that you would find in Washington or anywhere else. In fact, the advice that comes out of Naval War College for our military is at the top of their needed game. Of course, when we have professors from the Naval War College, they speak for themselves and not for the U.S. government. And Marc Genest returns to talk to us in a moment. First, here's the headline as to what's happening with North Korea. And here's what we had at press time in the mid-afternoon about the start.
After a 60-hour train ride from North Korea through China, Kim Jong-un arrived in Vietnam ahead of his second summit with President Trump. Surrounded by his security detail, the North Korean leader rolled through the streets en route to Hanoi as crowds of onlookers waved North Korean and Vietnamese flags.
I think we'll have a very tremendous summit.
Before leaving Washington, President Trump laid out the goals for both countries.
We want denuclearization, and I think he'll have a country that will set a lot of records for speed in terms of an economy.
This week's summit comes just 8 months after the two met in Singapore, where the end result was a vague commitment from Kim to work towards denuclearization of the Korean peninsula.
The worst-case scenario is a world living with a nuclear-armed North Korea forever.
Do-yeon Kim is a CBS News contributor and a nuclear and Korea expert with the Center for a New American Security.
What's the best hope for the United States here in Hanoi?
A clear sign that North Korea, that Kim Jong-un is willing to embark on a path towards complete denuclearization. What Kim Jong-un will be looking out for is what will he get in return for whatever baby step he might want to take on denuclearization.
Yeah, well, that's not rocket science. I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think this whole notion of North Korea denuclearizing, based on conversations I've had with you, some of your comrades, and my own reading and instinct, is that it's laughable on its face. More or less.
They can't even agree on how to define denuclearization. So if you can't even define the term you're supposed to be negotiating about, what does that tell you what the chances of it happening?
Yeah, right. So I don't know what that CBS expert is talking about, other than there is a lot of perhaps helpful puffery around all of this. And if we're going to give the president any kind of credit, it seems to me that, I don't know, I'm not sure. Now that the cat is out of the bag, or the horse left the gate, or the cows left the barn, or whatever, and this whole thing, this is the second meeting, that we'll remember that we actually wondered whether it was constructive for him to meet with Kim Jong-un. So let's go backwards. Was it constructive for him to do that the first time?
I don't think heads of state should meet in formal summits unless you know that the agreement has already been negotiated and the details worked out. You can have maybe one or two outstanding issues where the two leaders will meet head to head. But by giving Kim Jong-un the kind of respect that he gets on the international stage by meeting with the President of the United States without first coming to a solid negotiation, a solid treaty, I think is giving him way too much credit. And I think there was a mistake on Trump's part. On the other hand, Trump's rhetoric and Kim's rhetoric when he first came into office was incredibly strident. And they were talking about, they were literally throwing barbs out that they would want to attack the other. So to move from the kind of harsh rhetoric they were using to at least meeting formally did ratchet down the tension between the two countries. So in that respect, it was positive.
Well, the Rocket Man stuff and all that kind of thing, racking back and forth. Going backwards still, the president talked about this and has continued to talk about the idea that based on a conversation he had with President Obama in transition on the last day, the president's first, Trump's first, that he was certain that we were headed to war, and that he has been the white knight to protect the planet. How close were we?
Not very. Unfortunately, the president has a tendency toward exaggeration.
No. This just in.
But
where's the breaking news thing, Jess? Put that across the screen.
That's not to say that there weren't tensions between the two countries. In the United States, was carrying out joint operations with the South Koreans, particularly naval operations, which the North was very angry about. There had been acts of violence across the DMZ zone. So there were high tensions. But war, look, we've been on a war footing with the North Koreans for 70 years, since the termination of the conflict in Korea in the 1950s. But in terms of going from cold to hot war, the chances were nominal.
Okay. So if the chances were nominal, and the two of them, Trump and Jong-un, ratcheted up their behavior, it was more or less, or their rhetoric toward each other, it was on them.
Yes.
It was on them.
Right. Now, if Trump was here right now, he would say the reason he did that was you start off with really tough rhetoric to give yourself more flexibility when negotiations do come around. So if he was a wise negotiator, this kind of harsh rhetoric would have been backed up with perhaps bringing in more air defenses or something like that into South Korea to demonstrate the United States wasn't kidding around. So Trump can take some degree of credit by saying the harsh rhetoric forced Kim to reevaluate and reassess how he was treating the relations with the United States. So it is possible to give him some credit on that.
So talk to me about this concept that you were discussing in the beginning, which is that leaders should meet post-deal construction. America has just kind of been, I think, moved to this place that, talking is good. It's not always the case.
Well, talking is better than
Excuse me.
warring. So, the idea that the head of state is having one-on-one meetings with the other head of state is different than having lower levels, Secretary of State or Defense or other diplomats having one-on-one talks. That's the way normal diplomacy works, and the heads of state come in at the last second. So talking is always a good thing. The more you communicate, the more likely you are to avoid war.
All right, so moving ahead to this one, what is the transitional or transactional juice of this particular meeting? Is it just, geez, we missed each other? Been a long time, wanted to get together again, old pals?
Well, they are switching love letters.
Yeah, it's really weird. It's really weird. But what did we leave with the last one, and what is even the projected agenda for this one?
Well, okay, let's get a positive spin on this, because there's something to it. The first meeting was to set up the idea that we were going to enhance communication between the two countries. And that there always was supposed to be a follow-up meeting that was supposed to be more tangible. The first meeting was more ceremonial in nature. The second meeting was supposed to bring tangible results. Now the question is, will the president be able to deliver tangible results? And we can all hope that the freeze on nuclear testing and missile testing for the North will continue. I mean, if you're going to have just basic expectations, if he just gets those two things, then that's not in itself a bad thing to accomplish.
Well, the lack of testing that has been the case since the meeting, I think you'd have to say, at least for everybody's worry factor, has been a good thing.
The missile tests. Now remember, the North Koreans are great at negotiating, accepting negotiations, accepting terms, and then not following through.
Right.
They're the ultimate cheaters. So one of the things that we found, our intelligence agencies have found, this is all unclassified, is that they continue to improve their enrichment processes, to continue the research on nuclear development and missile development. While they're not testing, they are continuing to improve and to build new centers for their missiles as well as the nuclear program.
Well, how effective is that if you're not sending missiles up every once in a while?
Well, remember, they did a whole series of tests prior to Trump's meeting with Kim Jong-un.
Got done what they needed to get done on an interval?
Right.
Will they need to do that again?
Eventually they will have to, if they want to keep their program advancing.
Do you think they'll factor that into negotiations?
Yes, I think they will.
Do you think they'll be asking for agreement that they can?
I don't think we would give it to them. It doesn't mean that they won't break their agreement in the future.
So any future missile testing you think will eventually be a breakdown in the negotiations?
Yes, it will. And that's been stated by the Trump administration.
So where does that this notion of a definition of denuclearization, what does that where does that play in the middle of this whole thing?
Well, I mean, that's a great question, because for the United States, denuclearization means North Korea gives up its nuclear program. And Kim Jong-un has not accepted that as a definition. They would be more likely to talk about freezing their program or something other than doing away with the program. And frankly, getting Kim to denuclearize is probably way beyond our reach, because his regime depends on him having nuclear weapons. It gives him prestige. It allows Kim a sense of security for his neighbor, against his neighbors, the United States or South Korea or even China. So it's unlikely that his regime is going to ever give this up. So perhaps the best we can hope for is on-site inspections, a freezing of more development of missiles and nuclear technology. That would be a huge breakthrough for the Trump administration if they were to get that. And it has to be verifiable inspection of the nuclear facilities, which is incredibly problematic.
All right, when we come back, we'll talk about what the end game is for the North Korean administration. Stay with us. All right, what's his end game? What does he need?
Who?
Him.
Oh, Kim?
Yeah.
Kim needs relief on sanctions. That's the #1 goal for him. In fact, the irony of it is they're meeting in Vietnam. And Vietnam is a miracle, economic miracle, because the party now has opened up its economy to the rest of the world. It's developed a very strong relationship with the United States, and it's decentralized its economy while maintaining the power of the Communist Party within Vietnam. So they're using the China model, except it's a much friendlier model toward the United States than China's model is to the United States. So if the hope is that Kim Jong-un goes to Vietnam, sees the amazing industrial advances that Vietnam has undergone, and says, you know what, maybe I can work something out with the nuclear program in exchange for investment in North Korea.
He reportedly is using the same tactics as he tries to convince people that he wants to be more friendly with the United States. So now, if he gets criticized for doing that, he starts to jail or kill people. According to the reports. So his same tactics in keeping control have satisfied his new thinking about being a player. I mean, how weirdly perverse is that?
One of his heroes is Joe Stalin, and Stalin was famous for killing 30 to 50 million people, and anyone that was possibly in his way, he eliminated. I mean, he executed his uncle using anti-aircraft artillery. Literally just shooting it at his uncle because he was getting too close to China. So anyone that he deems either a potential threat or slightly disrespectful is eliminated, literally. So he has the flexibility to do what he chooses.
Is it in our best interest for our president to be talking about them becoming a next economic power?
Well, if it's done right. Right? I mean, if you want to incentivize Kim to make these kinds of changes and to be flexible in the nuclear negotiations, dangling economic reform and prosperity is a great way to get him, great incentive.
All right. Reportedly, the president may meet with him alone. Problem?
Big problem. I don't believe any head of state should meet with another head of state alone. Particularly if they are a belligerent, if they are not a close friend of the United States. It's not like meeting with Theresa May from Great Britain. This is meeting with a potential enemy of the United States. It was unwise for Trump to do that with Putin. It's certainly unwise for him to do it with Kim Jong-un.
Speaking of Putin, the ambassador is in these negotiations reportedly. He's come down and so we're getting a little Russian consultation. They got a relationship with North Korea as well. What is that all about?
That's really frightening to me, because in a press conference, Trump literally said, I don't believe our intelligence community, because Vladimir Putin told me that the North Koreans do not have intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the United States. So he's literally saying, I believe Putin over our CIA. It's absurd.
What role do you think Russia will play in the next couple of days?
I don't know. And that's one of the reasons why I do not want
and what's
him
their
meeting
end
alone.
game? What are they trying to accomplish?
Well, their end game is to weaken the United States as much as possible, to play as many games, both internally in the United States with elections, as well as external, and also to increase their influence wherever they can.
If that's so clear, what in heaven's name is he palling around with them for in this particular setting?
A hotel in Moscow? I mean, apparently that's what's going to happen. That's what his personal attorney is talking about, that even after election.
So you just dropped down, and this is not, I'm not criticizing you, but you just dropped down from a very high level conversation down to that.
Yeah, I have a talent for that.
But no, my point is that that's what I think most people who don't trust this president worry about, that this stuff, this grand level of international sensitivity and earthly survival and all of this can get boiled down to whether or not he gets a hotel in Russia. And somebody as smart as you can go there that quickly.
Yeah.
That's impossible to digest.
Well, it's not. Think about this. All your life, you are an entrepreneur. And your whole being, your whole essence is formulated around the idea of building things, expanding your economic empire, your real estate empire. And if you're a business person, it's hard to get out of that mindset and take the mindset of a statesman. So one, it's just a very difficult thing for anyone to do. And two, I think Trump doesn't believe he necessarily has to diverge from businessman to president, that the two aren't necessarily contradictory.
And we sit here and we watch it. Michael Cohen is, actually, while we do this, we'll take a break, we'll come back and we'll talk about the implications. Although he's not supposed to be talking about Russia today and tomorrow in public. Could you imagine split screen? He's talking about hotels in Russia and whatever. Be right back. All right, so while this is going on, you got the summit going on in Vietnam. This is I don't know. The timing on this is coincidental, I guess. Michael Cohen is going to, well, he's today, as you're watching this tonight, earlier today, he was with the Senate in closed doors. And reportedly, he's going to be talking with the House on a public basis. Can't talk about Russia, reportedly. You expecting anything in trouble for the president here with this? I mean, if it's about his being a bad guy and being a racist and being, mean and da-da-da, I don't think the American public's going to, I mean, it's going to be like, yeah, well, no kidding. But if he drops any bombs about, criminal behavior, even with women and the transactional stuff, I mean, that may heat up. How does that impact what's going on with the summit? Does any of it tie together in terms of the president's attention span and capability?
Well, I think the worst case scenario, and Trump is known for this, is you distract the public with some other big news event. So if there's going to be a big news event surrounding his attorney, then he's going to try perhaps to get a big deal in North Korea to change the news cycle. And if he does, more power to him, unless it's not in the interest of the United States for this deal to actually happen. If he concedes too much.
But what deal could possibly happen if they can't agree on the definition of denuclearization?
I am afraid, as an incentive, that Trump will say, okay, we can have a formal ending of the Korean War, which is something the North Koreans really want, in exchange for promises only. And the North has done that repeatedly in the past. You have to have firm commitments that are verifiable and that you can enforce. If you're not going to have verifiable enforcement, then it's not worth it with the Koreans.
We're swinging back to negotiations, but it's important. What does the end of the war declaration really mean for them?
It means legitimacy in the eyes of the international community, and that's very, very important. That's number one.
Because they're still the bad guy in conflict with the South.
Yes, and it also
accepts... Does the South have to sign off on that?
Yes, they do, but they've already talked about wanting to do that. In fact, one of the things that we have to do is make sure that the South Koreans don't get ahead of us in the negotiations and start conceding more than we want to before we can get tangible results out of the North.
A lot to keep track on it. Going back to Cohen, do you find this to be just interesting byproduct, or between McCabe and Cohen and all that's going on that way, the Mueller report somewhat around the corner, it affects this how?
Well, a president is only as powerful as his public support. So if President Trump's support continues to decline, then his ability to get anything through Congress, his ability to, be a force in international politics is diminished.
Does this Vietnam trip dominate the headlines this week, but fall quickly back to another place when he comes home?
Well, the news media is traditionally ADHD. So, they never stay on one topic for very long.
But if there's a substantive development in these negotiations, there's a stick-to-itiveness to the story.
Sure.
Do you expect that this thing will be a flash this week and not much later, or do you expect this
The negotiations?
Yeah. Or you expect something profound to come out of here?
I do not expect something profound to come out.
But he'll say something profound happens.
Absolutely, that's what we can expect. And look, if the president just gets a continuation of the cessation of missile tests and nuclear tests, then that is a constructive, positive thing. Now, it's not changing the nature of the international system at all, but it's a small but good step.
By the way, the wall. Did you ever hear about this story that Mexico is going to pay for the wall? And, there's some Republicans are peeling off. They'll probably support the House resolution against the declaration of emergency. He'll veto it, and they'll override it. Right? Talk about the security of the wall. We only got a minute or so.
Well, look. I mean, as someone who believes in the Constitution, the executive using this new power to justify getting money for the wall, to me, is a real threat against the separation of powers. I mean, the Congress is the first, the legislative branch is Article 1 of the Constitution. It was supposed to be the dominant branch of government. And the president has continued over the years to take more and more power from the legislature. Republicans who call themselves conservative need to stand up against this.
It's going to be fascinating. It's going to be a busy couple of weeks here when it comes to national and international. By the way, Brexit going to get revoted? They are stuck in a rock and a hard place there, aren't they? All revved up with no place to go because they found out all revved up is almost like suicide.
Both the Labour Party and the Conservatives, the Tories, are taking big hits on this. I suspect that they were going to allow a referendum on whether or not to leave the EU. And I don't expect the European Union to be moderate in their negotiations. They've had a firm line against the British, and they see that it's paying dividends.
You think it's a good thing to revote and to say no?
Yes, I do, because it's going to really hurt London's financial sector, which is one of the great financial centers of the world. And they're already beginning to move to Europe.
My funny feeling is I've seen too many stories of people who voted yes over there and didn't even realize what their own business ramifications were going to be.
Right. Never mind relations with Ireland, which is a very problematic situation.
All right. Huh. Other than that, what's new? Anything? Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it. A final word when we come back. Don't ever read your email during the show. Sorry. Somebody made me laugh. Coming up tomorrow, we will take a look at sports gaming here in Rhode Island, which has this momentum of fait accompli, but really, someone's going to have to take a little bit of a step back and wonder whether or not we need constitutional passage for things like mobile gaming and the like. A professor from Providence College who's really good at this and studies the ramifications of such will join us on the Wednesday program. All right, don't forget to join us on the radio on WPRO weekdays 3 till 6. Going to be a busy week, and I'm guessing a lot of folks tomorrow will have thoughts on the public testimony of Michael Cohen. Maybe we'll talk to you. Good night.